I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Andy Hunt. Be sure to check out my films out there in the streaming universe. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and a few more. We are booking guests for February. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Visit our website, forbiddenknowledge.news. It's the home of the Forbidden Knowledge Network. We feature some of your favorite podcasts and content creators. We're having our film fundraiser for movie number 3. We're going to have some fun with this one. It's going to be a sci-fi comedy mockumentary featuring myself and many of your favorite researchers, authors, and content creators. If you would like to make a donation, please use the link right in the description. Anything is greatly appreciated. Today I want to welcome Andy Hunt. He is a researcher and host of Control-Alt History, which presents underreported, forgotten, and hidden history. Andy, welcome. How you doing?
Hey, doing well, man. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. I'm very excited for this episode. You've done some incredible work extracting and presenting some awesome stories, people, and events from history. Your channel, Control-Alt History, has a great archive of information. But today we're going to focus on a few of the specific deep dives you have done recently that I've really enjoyed. There's still a lot to get to. Before we do, this is your first time on. Let the audience know a little bit about yourself and also how they can find out more.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, I run a YouTube channel primarily, Control-Alt History, like Control-Alt-Delete, only Control-Alt History, and just kind of focus on various mysteries and, conspiracies, quote unquote, from history, and typically go pretty deep into a lot of them. Everything from, things from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and 90s is kind of my focus. So somewhat recent history, but occasionally I'll get into things that are a little older than that. And on Instagram and Twitter, just Control-Alt History on both. And not terribly active on there, but that's where I post a lot of times. I'll just announce when I post a new video and everything. But yeah, YouTube is definitely where most of my followers are.
Right on. Well, tell us a little bit about your journey and how you got here. What got you interested in alternative history and ultimately brought you to making videos?
Yeah, well, I've always been interested in like mysteries and things like that. I've always been a huge reader. And, growing up, I definitely really liked, the like aliens and UFOs and kind of those mysteries. And I don't get into that too much on my channel. It's more kind of political intrigue and suspicious murders and things like that. But as far as how I started my channel, one of my favorite videos I've done, it's on the Vicki Morgan murder from 1983. And it's a real interesting mystery about this girl who was the mistress of this guy, Alfred Bloomingdale, who's from the Bloomingdale department store chain family. And Alfred Bloomingdale was in tight with Ronald Reagan. And he had this mistress named Vicki Morgan. And then after Alfred Bloomingdale died, she came out and said that Alfred Bloomingdale was basically kind of like an Epstein-type character where he would just have these massive sex parties in this sex dungeon in his house. And it's a long, complicated story. Maybe we can get into it. But anyway, I read about it in a book, and I was like, wow, this is like Ronald Reagan's right-hand man is really close. They're both really close, has this like crazy sex dungeon and all this stuff.
Wow.
And he videotaped everything. So there's all this blackmail involved. It's just a wild story. And I read about it in the book, wanted to learn more. And there wasn't really much out there about it. I was just shocked. I couldn't find anything. And so I just decided to really start researching it as much as I could and had all this information on it. And so just kind of decided to put it into a video that kind of summarizes it and goes into all the strangeness going on with that story. And that was my first video. I'd never, created a video or anything like that. So it was definitely a learning experience. But yeah, it was really the Vicky Morgan scandal. And that's generally the mysteries and the stories that I like focusing on my channel is things that are like really kind of underreported or just a lot of times been forgotten about.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'll get comments from people saying like, wow, this is the craziest story. I've never heard of this. And, some of these stories are just massive. They involve really powerful, really well-known names, but, I guess, some people use the term memory hole sometimes. And a lot of these really have been just kind of memory holed and forgotten about. And there's really not a ton out there about them. So those are kind of like the mysteries I like focusing on.
Excellent. Well, like I was telling you earlier, you've got a lot of content and we've got limited time. I wanted to discuss so much of your work. I put Vicky Morgan on the list of things that we can go over. So we'll probably be doing this again in the future to get to more of these topics. So I picked out a few that we could get to today that sounded very interesting. I'm sure my audience is going to enjoy this. We'll start with something that's been fresh in people's minds, and this is a mystery, a strange synchronistic mystery surrounding Erica Kirk. Not today's Erica Kirk, but one from the 1960s. Maybe you could break this down for everybody.
Yeah, so basically in the 1960s, the Florida First Lady was named Erica Kirk, and she bears a very striking resemblance to the current Erica Kirk. At least I think she does. I think they look very, very similar. A lot of other people do too. Yeah. And so it's really bizarre. I mean, it's spelled the exact same. It's spelled, Erica's spelled with a K, which isn't, necessarily the common way to spell it. And though Erica Kirk from the 1960s, so she was First Lady of Florida, but there's like this real mystery surrounding her because she was married to a guy named Claude Kirk. And this Claude Kirk was just this real character. He was a really flamboyant, like really outspoken politician, actually, very kind of like Charlie Kirk-esque. And he was elected Florida governor in like 1967, I believe. And he was always single, or he wasn't always single, but he was divorced at the time, and he was kind of like a bit of a playboy. And then he showed up to his inauguration ball with this girl, and he just referred to her as Madam X. And that's how he would introduce her to people. It was kind of like this real air of mystery because no one had ever seen her with him before or anything like that. And so he referred to this girl as Madam X, and she just showed up to the inauguration ball with him. Eventually, it was learned that her name was Erica Kirk. And she had a strange backstory because she was born in Germany and then moved to South America. And there were a whole bunch of Nazis that, moved to South America after the war. And so there's kind of like a bit of intrigue about her background and why she, made this journey. I mean, there's an official story that says she was just a model who went there. But yeah, she's a real kind of person of mystery, and it seemed just so incredibly strange that they had the same name, they look alike, and then actually it was just kind of coincidentally the video that I did right before I learned about this whole Erica Kirk mystery. It was about human cloning, and human cloning is really fascinating. It's something that might kind of seem really out there, really far-fetched to some people. But it's really not. It was talked about. It's really interesting to see how much it was talked about back in the 1970s. I mean, it was talked about all the time. There were tons, absolutely tons of leading scientists and geneticists who were saying, like, human cloning, it's going to happen. And this is like the early 1970s. Like, human cloning is just right around the corner. And there's one guy who described it as the most drastic biological change it would be the most drastic biological change in all of humankind's recorded history. because people had talked about how, well, instead of just having a baby the normal way, you could just choose some famous person from history, and as long as you have a little bit of their DNA, you could create an embryo of that person with just an exact genetic replica of that person. And so there's talk of societies of just people who look alike, and I mean, they really get into a lot of just really intriguing, pretty wild stuff. And again, this was 50 years ago, so it was just kind of coincidental that that happened to be the video that I did, and that was the topic that I really explored right before I learned about this Eric Kirk mystery. And so I kind of talk a bit about, well, could this, modern day Eric Kirk be a human clone? Is there like some sort of genetic program where they're taking, because one of the things that was always talked about with human cloning in these articles from the 1970s was, well, how cool would it be if we could, clone all these important figures from history,
Yeah.
and have whoever, take your pick, great thinkers, great scientists, great athletes, like whoever. We could just create exact genetic replicas of these people. And so yeah, that was kind of the video I did right before the Eric Kirk thing. And so I kind of talk a bit about, because also the intriguing thing too is, as I mentioned, she was born in Germany, then moved to South America. Whole bunch of Nazis did the same thing, and the Nazis were really big into like genetic experiments, a lot of cloning. Joseph Mengele in particular was like basically obsessed with the idea of identical twins, and he, pretty infamously did all these experiments and whatnot with identical twins. And so, yeah, I just kind of explored the mystery. That Claude Kirk ended up being a really fascinating guy to look into too. He has a number of pretty interesting connections himself, and
He kind of
never even heard of him
looks
before.
somewhat like Charlie Kirk as well.
I think he kind of does too. Yeah, he was older. Charlie Kirk was, I think, in early 30s, and Claude Kirk was about late 40s, early 50s. So the ages don't quite add up. But yeah, if you added about 50, 60 pounds to Charlie Kirk and aged him by about 20 years, he would look very similar to Claude Kirk. So
Wasn't there a movie about Hitler clones in South America or something like that?
yeah, Boys from Brazil. Yeah, and that was the whole plot of that movie was that a group of underground Nazis who escaped Germany, went to South America, were basically trying to rebuild the Third Reich by creating this big army of Adolf Hitler clones. And, these would be babies. When we're talking about human cloning here, we're not talking about like creating an exact replica of someone as they are today. We're talking about creating an embryo, a baby clone of that person. So, yeah, the plot of the movie is that they want to create, they do create in the movie just hundreds of Adolf Hitler clones, and they place them all throughout the world with different families in the hopes that one day one of them will basically grow up to emulate Hitler's life and lead a resurgence of the Third Reich.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I've seen other deep dives into the possibility of cyclical characters that show up throughout our history that look oddly alike and sometimes almost identical. It's like they're long lost twin from a different era showing up. And I did a show just yesterday talking about the possibility of creating moon children, in a sense, using ritual magic to incarnate certain beings into humans at certain points, or creating celebrities or politicians using these rituals. But you could also apply that to clones. We've heard the recent testimony of certain people that claiming to be clones, and it gets wild, man. I love it.
It gets wild. Yeah, I mean, like I said, the video I did on cloning, it was probably 30, 40 minutes. I get pretty deep into it, but I really focus on just what was talked about in the 1970s, because it's just so interesting to me that we were talking over 50 years ago that there was all this. I mean, there were just so many articles about human cloning back then and how inevitable it was. It was a really hot button time. I mean, you're talking like mainstream publications. You're not talking, underground stuff like, articles and newspapers, magazines, everything like that. And again, like one of the really intriguing things is that one of the things that is just talked about all the time in these in these articles, is how you could create clones of famous people from throughout history, and kind of bring a just an exact genetic replica of that person to our modern time.
Yeah,
So
it's crazy, man.
it's real interesting.
Now,
Yeah.
moving to another sort of recent event that you've done a video about, Rob Reiner's son and the possibility that he may be this online reference to Star Child. Talk a little bit about this story,
Yeah.
because I have not heard about this before.
Yeah, it's real interesting. So back in 2009, there was a message board thread that got really popular, and it's kind of referred to as the Star Child thread. And basically, how it started, it's kind of a winding story, but how it started was that someone posted on an internet message board site that was popular at the time, and they said, "Well, I have a friend who works for MTV, and his job for MTV was installing hidden cameras in the house that Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey lived in during the show Newlyweds." And these were hidden cameras they didn't know about. And apparently, these hidden cameras captured like some really, really bad stuff that went down in the house. MTV owned the house at the time. So, he says it doesn't necessarily involve Jessica Simpson and Nick Lachey because people were in and out of the house all the time. And basically, what this guy talked about when he was posting on this thread was that his friend felt guilty about his involvement, and so he grabbed the footage from those hidden cameras that they had captured, and he went on the run, and he was preparing to release it either onto the internet or release it, in some way. And allegedly, the friend claimed that what was on these tapes was just mind-blowing stuff that was really gonna just bring down Hollywood. I mean, it was that bad. And so the whole thread is just fascinating to read. It kind of like, people are kind of like disbelieving at first, like, oh, wait, like this is crazy. This type of stuff goes on in Hollywood. And then the whole bunch of people kind of chime in and like, yes, like I work. And again, it's anonymous people posting on an internet message board thread. So, take it with a grain of salt or believe it if you want to or not. But so many people contributed to the thread talking about their experiences working in Hollywood and just the terrible things that they saw behind the scenes. And it really evolved from just that one post into like all these people posting and talking about people. And so anyway, there was one poster in particular. His name was Star Child, and he was named Star Child because he claimed he was the child of a famous movie star, of a famous person involved in Hollywood. And he posted like in really detail and very graphic detail about just all the abuse and all the horrible things that he suffered from because of his father while he was growing up. And it's really sad to read. It's very heartbreaking to read. And then the kind of the debate has always been like, well, who was this? Like, if this person was the son or the daughter of a famous person in Hollywood, who could it have been? And people kind of speculated about who it could be. One of the names that was thrown out there was Tom Hanks's son, not Colin Hanks, but
Chet.
the other one with all the tattoos,
Yeah.
Chet Hanks. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then there was another guy. His name is escaping me right now, but he played Boner on Growing Pains. His dad was.
I don't know the name either, but I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, I know it. I'll think of it in a second. Andrew, I think is his first name. I'll think of it in a second. But his dad was on the original Star Trek. And so he was, the son of a pretty famous guy. And he ended up committing suicide right while this thread was very popular. And so, that news came out, and Star Child never posted again after, this Andrew Koenig was his name. And Star Child never posted again after this Andrew Koenig hung himself in a park in Canada. And so people speculated like, well, that's kind of coincidental timing. Like, could it have been him? And so anyway, I did a video, a while back, just kind of going through the thread. I mean, the thread just really took fire and really went viral, and it's hundreds of pages long. It's just a massive thread. There's really good stuff in there, really interesting stuff, and there's also a lot of just, troll posts or whatnot. And I did a video where I just went through the whole thread and picked out the best posts and kind of read them off and went into more detail in some instances. And then when the whole Rob Reiner thing happened, when, his throat was slit, him and his wife's throats were slit by their son, I did another video just, a month ago or so speculating like, well, could it have been Rob Reiner's son back in the day who was posting as Star Child in this thread? Because, it's a pretty extreme way to kill someone, to slit both of their throats. Like, that's not just, kind of a quick thing where you stab them and you shoot them or whatever. Like, that's pretty deeply personal to do something that extreme.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of revisited the Star Child thread, and he left like a few clues, I guess, into what his identity could have been in his posts, but he didn't give too much away because he was, very paranoid about being caught because he thought he'd be killed. But so I, kind of get into some of that and speculate like, hey, maybe it could have been Rob Reiner's son who was posting, back in 2009. And then the interesting thing about the Star Child thread is a lot of the things that some people had talked about and posted about, it ended up becoming true down the road. And it was like, for instance, like multiple people posted about Tiger Woods and how he wasn't this like squeaky clean All-American guy, which is really what his image was at the time. And then right while the thread was happening and people had been talking about him, just very shortly after that was when that whole thing went down, like Thanksgiving weekend, where his wife discovered he was cheating on her and she flipped out, and all this stuff started coming out about, all the women he'd been involved with and all the illicit things like that. And so that ended up, becoming true, but people were talking about that before that had come out. A lot of people mentioned P. Diddy in the thread about how just nasty he was behind the scenes. And again, like, people, knew he might not have the best reputation, but as far as like being, involved in like underage kids and things like that seemed pretty extreme. But in light of what has come out, it's taken 15 years, but in light of what's come out recently, a lot of what's talked about P. Diddy in the thread ended up becoming true. So, there is kind of some various things like that kind of lend some credibility to it, even though, like I said, it is just anonymous people posting on an internet message board.
Well, you mentioned that there may have been some clues that indicate it was indeed Rob Reiner's son. Could you give us an example?
Yeah. And then the tough thing is, like the Star Child poster, when he was posting, he talked about how he was purposely giving some disinformation out just because he wanted to kind of throw off the scent of, anybody who might suspect that he was the one posting about it. And so it gets difficult to, kind of try to narrow down like who exactly it was or who it could have been, because he, himself said that some of the things he says about himself aren't exactly true. But yeah, I mean, just the brutal nature of the crime just seemed like, there really might be something more to it. One thing I did find was that the Rob Reiner house was built by Henry Fonda, who's the father of like Peter Fonda and Jane Fonda. And he was involved in some pretty dark stuff over the years. And, one of the things Star Child talks about is how his dad has a dungeon in the basement of their house where just a whole bunch of really horrible stuff happens. And, it definitely seems like Hank Fonda could have been the type of guy who would build something like that into his house. But yeah, the whole thing's just real interesting to kind of go through.
It's very interesting to see some of the information and awareness that's coming out about these ultra celebrities and producers and the corruption. I remember growing up, these were such beloved characters, and the more information that surfaces about them, the more psychopathic they seem to be. It seems that many of them are involved in some kind of multi-generational MK Ultra programs to ensure that they continue to put out these psychopathic personalities that'll fit wonderfully in Hollywood and powerful positions like that.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's always the sons and daughters. It's like once you're kind of in the in the group, so to speak, or in the
Mm.
family. Yeah, a lot of people seem to not have any reservations about bringing their sons and daughters into some of the dark stuff that they're involved in too.
Yeah. I'm hoping there will be more to come out and maybe some closure and justice served in the future, but it doesn't seem to go that way, especially you look at what just happened with the Diddy trial. The dude's going to spend, maybe a year or two in jail and be let out. There's no real consequences for any
Right.
of that stuff, so it's very interesting. The next thing I wanted
Oh
to
yeah.
get to was the Gemstone file. This is fascinating. I've heard a little bit about this before, but never was able to go as deep as you've gone into some of the information. It's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit about that and some of the lesser known information that you found.
Yeah, certainly. So I guess first up, for those who don't know, the Gemstone file, it was a document that kind of really went viral almost, like really gained in popularity back in the 1970s. So obviously it was before the internet. And what it was written by a guy who claimed he was majorly connected to a group of rich, powerful people who essentially ran the world. And he had written up like basically a document, a gemstone file that told like the true history of, everything from the JFK assassination to Chappaquiddick to the Watergate, break-in to every major event, from like the 1940s through the 1960s and 70s. And so he wrote up this document that told the true story, what he claimed was the true story behind all these events. And and then, obviously back then it was before the internet, so he printed up some copies, and the document basically went kind of viral in a sense because people would print it off and then kind of pass it to their friends, and then those friends would pass it to their friends, and it kind of spread throughout the country like wildfire that way, from college campus to underground groups. It was very popular in underground groups, and it would just kind of be passed from one person to the next, and it really covers some wild, just crazy stuff. The disappearance of Howard Hughes plays a really big part in the whole thing, and that to me is like the absolute ultimate mystery, the ultimate conspiracy. Like, it's so fascinating to look into.
There's also a huge chunk of
And
information about this character, Aristide Onassis, who was Jacqueline Onassis' second husband.
yes, yeah, I would say Howard Hughes and Aristotle Onassis are kind of like the two main players in the story that's told in the Gemstone file. And Aristotle, both of them are just absolutely fascinating people. I guess Howard Hughes, for those who, I mean, everybody probably recognizes the name, but they might not know his story. But Howard Hughes, for a very long stretch throughout the 1930s, 40s, into the 1950s, he was basically like Elon Musk crossed with Leonardo DiCaprio, crossed with like Bill Gates. He was one of the richest people alive. He had all these like really state of the art revolutionary companies similar to Elon Musk that were like doing some really cutting edge work. And then he was also just like a humongous playboy. I mean, he dated every single famous actress at the time. He was just constantly out, out about town with a different woman. And I mean, he like bought a movie studio. He bought RKO Pictures and owned a movie studio. He made all his money because he was in the oil business, and the drill bits that his company made were just way better than everything else that was out there. So these oil companies would just fork over money to him, just hand over fist to get their hands on it. And yeah, he was involved in like a whole bunch of different like revolutionary aircrafts and just a whole bunch of crazy stuff. And he was just always in the news everywhere. He's biggest celebrity in the world, richest man in the world. And then around the mid 1950s, he just vanished off the face of the earth. and was never once seen in public again until he officially died in 1973, I think it was, or 1974. And so for about 2 decades, he went from, dating every A-list Hollywood actress and constantly giving press conferences and everything to just never once appearing in public. And it is incredibly, incredibly strange. And so the Gemstone file really gets into the whole disappearance of Howard Hughes. And the other character who's talked about a lot in the Gemstone file is Aristotle Onassis. And he is such an interesting guy. Most people just kind of know him as like the guy who married Jackie Kennedy after JFK died. Way more to Aristotle Onassis than that. He too was one of the richest people on earth for a while. He lived on a private island in the Mediterranean Sea. It was named Scorpios. It is like just the coolest residence you've ever seen.
Yeah.
I mean, it is amazing. He dated a ton of women too. They always say that he has a ton of similarities to Blofeld from the Bond movies, like the number of very, very like striking similarities. So they always say that Blofeld was kind of based on Onassis. And anyway, the Gemstone file kind of claims that Onassis was basically the most powerful man alive. He was the worldwide head of the mafia. He was like the head dude, majorly involved in drug trafficking because he owned a humongous fleet of oil tankers. And so the Gemstone file talks how he was really shipping drugs. And he was kind of from like the Golden Triangle region where a ton of opium originated. And so that kind of adds up. But like Aristotle Onassis owned the most luxurious casino in the world. He basically owned the city of Monte Carlo. Really fascinating guy. But the whole story that's told in the Gemstone file is that the reason Howard Hughes kind of just abruptly vanished off the face of the earth is that Aristotle Onassis kidnapped him and then took over this massive Howard Hughes empire and kept him alive because if, it was announced that, Howard Hughes was actually dead, the companies would have been dissolved or they would have went to other people. So they kept up this whole big, charade that Howard Hughes was still alive and he was just had turned kind of shy all of a sudden. And it later came out, the story that later came out was that he had gone crazy. And, if you've ever seen the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, they talk about how he, locked himself away in hotel rooms and never wanted to see daylight and grew his fingernails out and only ate chocolate bars and did all this just crazy stuff. But it's interesting because that wasn't like the narrative right away. He, basically vanished in the mid 1950s, and the whole narrative that he was, crazy and doing all these crazy things, that didn't really come out until like the early 1970s. So there was a 15-year stretch or so where, anytime someone would bring up Howard Hughes, it was just always mentioned that he was really shy or he was really bashful or he didn't like publicity. Yeah. And, you look at the Howard Hughes thing and looking back on it, it's just like, wow, how did anybody fall for this? Or like, how did they keep this up for so long? Yeah. And, but yeah, so that's kind of the real basic part of the Gemstone file is that Howard Hughes had this massive empire, vanished off the face of the earth, and the Gemstone file claims Aristotle Onassis, who was head of the worldwide head of the mafia, kidnapped Hughes, took over his empire, and with the Howard Hughes empire under his belt, he had like even way more power than he had before. And so they get into like, Onassis was behind the assassination of JFK. And,
you make the connection with the Mormon Mafia as well. I'm always fascinated with how much power those guys had.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the real interesting things is like, there was this Mormon Mafia who were supposedly the only people who interacted with Howard Hughes for basically the last, 15, 16 years of his life after he vanished. And they were, said they were the ones who kind of, tended to him on a daily basis. But it's like, well, can you really trust them? There's this another really fascinating guy who's talked about in the Gemstone files, this guy Bob Mayhew. And so Bob Mayhew was a former CIA agent, and then he opened up his own kind of like private firm. And he was a contractor, so the CIA would contract a lot of work to him, and it's always said that Bob Mayhew's agency that he had was the inspiration for the TV show Mission Impossible, because basically when the CIA wanted certain things done that they couldn't necessarily be directly involved in, they didn't want their fingerprints on it. So they would go to Bob Mayhew's organization. It was called Robert A. Mayhew and Associates, RAMA, Rama. They would, contract the work out to Bob Mayhew and have him kind of, he had a whole cast of people that he employed and who specialized in various things. But, Bob Mayhew was allegedly involved in everything from blackmail and assassinations and a whole bunch of just really black book type stuff. And so he's talked about a lot in the Gemstone file too. He's a absolutely fascinating guy as well.
Right on. You also go into the author of the Gemstone files background and life a little bit, Bruce Roberts, and speculate whether the whole thing was legit or not.
Yeah, the guy who wrote it, his name was Bruce Roberts, and he was a real person. There's photos out there of him and everything. He had a real fascinating life because first of all, his father-in-law was like a diplomat or something. That's not the right word, but he was the official government person in the whole Golden Triangle region for, I think, France. It's been a while since I have looked at the Gemstone file, but it was a major country, and he was like the diplomat or whatever for the Golden Triangle region. And since he was such a high-ranking politician in that region, a lot of the stuff that's talked about in the Gemstone file was like kind of known by the people in that region. It was just kind of, not the type of thing you really want to talk about or broadcast out there if you value your life, because they wanted to keep the whole thing under wraps and just how big it was. But yeah. And so can you hear that in the background?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I just heard some faint noises. Not too bad.
Oh, okay, good. And so that was Bruce Roberts' father-in-law. He was the diplomat for that region. And then so he would feed Bruce Roberts kind of like information about Onassis, who was also based in that region, and some of the other things that were going on in that region. And so that was one of his contacts. And then the real interesting contact that he had was that he was really into crystallography. So he was like he invented, the reason it's called the Gemstone file was he invented the artificial way to create gemstones. So basically a way to grow, diamonds. And one of the really cutting edge technologies that was going on at the time was laser technology. That was just kind of like just being developed, as the 1950s hit. And that was going to be like the big technology that would just revolutionize everything, because it was, used in a lot of weapons, like a lot of cutting edge weapons. And so there was this mad race among, companies and whatnot to really develop this laser technology. Bruce Roberts created a way, since he was so involved in crystallography, he created a way to create these like artificial gemstones that were just really pure quality. Apparently they were like the best quality, and just creating a gemstone in a lab was a million times easier than going out and mining it and, doing all that. And so anyway, since he had these gemstones that he'd created, Bruce Roberts, he started working with the Howard Hughes organization because they were really big into the whole laser technology and developing that. And as he started working with like really high up people at the Howard Hughes organization, he started kind of being fed information about that, about how there was like just some really weird stuff going on with the Hughes organization. And a lot of people who, kind of were in the know would feed him information about the whole Howard Hughes situation as well. So he kind of had like these two like dual sources of information between his father-in-law, who was the politician in the Golden Triangle region, and then his connections at the Howard Hughes organization. And so based on the information he was getting, that's what he kind of used to write the Gemstone file, and that was kind of the basis of his research.
Yeah. If you had to speculate, would you say that it's most likely accurate what he was presenting?
I think there's parts of it that I think it's like, one of my favorite people that I like listening to, her name was Mae Brussel, and she was kind of like she's known as like the queen of conspiracy because she was really like a legendary radio personality from back in the 70s and 80s who had a weekly radio broadcast where she would talk about, conspiracies and whatnot. And she, really knowledgeable and really entertaining to listen to. And she initially didn't think the Gemstone file had any merit. But she eventually kind of came around and thought that it was about 75% accurate. I kind of think that was probably the case too. I think there's a lot of truth in it. I think it's still missing a lot of things. There's no real, most people would probably say like the Jewish mafia is, pretty powerful, involved in a lot of things that's never really mentioned throughout the Gemstone file. So it's almost kind of like a simplified version of what's going on. Like I think I do think a lot of it's true. I mean, and again, like kind of with the Star Child thread, there's there's certain things that really make you go, make you wonder if there might be some legitimacy to it, because like one of the things, Aristotle Onassis, he lived on a private island, Scorpios, like I mentioned. And there are photos out there because basically what the Gemstone file says is, he kidnapped Howard Hughes, took over his empire, and then kept Hughes as a prisoner on his island. And so he, basically just kept drugging Howard Hughes until he just kind of wilted away and turned into this like shell of a man. But he kept him alive the whole time in case shit went down basically, and people demanded to see that Howard Hughes was still alive. He could, that was kind of like the contingency plan. He could still wheel him out and show him off if need be. But there are photos that, tourists and people who are on boats that went by Aristotle Onassis' island, there are photos of this this really old, like mysterious guy in a wheelchair. He's just totally withered away. And it's on, it's on Aristotle Onassis' private island, and it kind of adds up with this idea that Howard Hughes could have been kept as a prisoner on that island.
Yeah.
And so much of what it talks about it really like seemingly connects dots. Like a lot of it really does seem to make sense. But again, I think there's just a lot more to the story too that he doesn't quite get into, because again, he only had, he had his father-in-law who was his contact for a lot of the news about the Golden Triangle region and all the drug activity that was going on there. And then he had his firsthand involvement in the Hughes organization. So that was another source of information, but he didn't have, contacts in maybe some of the other like organizations that were also powerful as well. So yeah, I do. I mean, at any rate, it's a really fascinating read. I mean, it's really fascinating, and as with some of this stuff, like it seems really hard that someone could just make it up. Like you would have to have one hell of an imagination to just make this up and make it believable, and not have a million holes in it or anything like that. Like it'd be insanely difficult to just make something like this up off the top of your head. So, yeah.
Well, we got time for a couple more. I thought we could get to a fun one. I didn't get to watch the video yet, but I saw you had one about a reporter held gunpoint to warn about aliens taking over the Earth. Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, boy, you're going way back. Yeah, that was about a year and a half ago or so that I did a video on that. The guy's name was Gary Stolman. And his father was a contributor for a television station in one of the news broadcasts in Los Angeles. And one day, and I think it was 82 or 1983, The news broadcast was, going on like normal, and then Gary Stolman showed up, and he held the reporter who was on camera at gunpoint, and he forced him to read a message that Gary Stolman himself had written out. And so, you can find the video on YouTube and everything. And yeah, the whole video is, this reporter is being held at gunpoint, and he's reading off this message that Gary Stolman wrote out. And the message that he talks about is how there's this basically a reptilian, species who are imitating humans, plotting to kind of take over the earth. He says his father is one of them. His father has been replaced by one of these. And then I kind of get into there's another, and the name will probably escape me because it's been so long since I did the video. But then, like in 2009 or so, there was this really interesting letter that came out written by a guy who claimed a lot of the same stuff that Gary Stolman talked about. And this guy had, there was a congressman or a senator from Idaho. And this guy had shown up. He was a pastor of a church. His name was Tim Remington. And this guy who wrote the letter showed up to the church, and he shot the pastor because he claimed he was a reptilian. And he shot him like 6 or 7 times with hollow point bullets, and like somehow the guy survived. This Tim Remington survived. But there was like some similarities there between and anyway, this guy who I can't recall his name off the top of my head, but the guy who shot the pastor in Idaho, he wrote this it's like a really articulate, really interesting letter to read. I mean, he doesn't seem like some, psychopathic crazy guy. He had, he's very well educated, but he just wrote this whole letter about, this reptilian race of which this pastor was a part of it, who were, doing just horrible things and kind of trying to take over the world. And it just seemed kind of interesting how there was like these similarities between what the two people talked about. And, it was like 2-3 decades apart.
Yeah.
I think I did a bad job of explaining it, but yeah, you can find a video on the internet of the news reporter being held at gunpoint and forced to read the letter that he wrote. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Well, earlier when you first gave an introduction, you were talking about an early video you made that was one of your favorites about Vicki Morgan and the mystery surrounding her. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so Vicki Morgan, she was like a call girl in California, and she was involved with this guy Alfred Bloomingdale, who was a really rich, really really rich guy. He was very very close with Ronald Reagan. Alfred Bloomingdale's wife and Nancy Reagan were actually best friends. So the Bloomingdales would always host like fundraising parties for Ronald Reagan. And this dated back to, Ronald Reagan was governor of California. This was all in California. And this dated back to when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, back before he became president. And so anyway, what happened is like in 1983, Alfred Bloomingdale died. And he was from Bloomingdale's department store chain family. That's how he had a lot of his money. And after he died, this girl, Vicki Morgan, came forward and said, "Hey, I've been Alfred Bloomingdale's mistress for the past 2 decades, and he didn't leave, and he would give me $10,000 a month when he was alive. Now that he's dead, that money's cut off, and I'm going broke. I'm entitled, since I was so close to him, I'm entitled to some of these, millions upon millions of dollars that he had when he died." And then, so she kind of tried to get money from the family. They told her to, go kick dirt, basically. And so she decided to kind of make everything public. And she said, "Okay, well, if you're not going to help me out," she made everything public about how she was his mistress for 2 some decades. And not only was she his mistress, but she participated in a whole bunch of like sex parties and sex orgies. She claimed Alfred Bloomingdale had a sex dungeon in the basement of his house where her and other prostitutes would come over and not only be involved with Alfred Bloomingdale, but a whole bunch of like really powerful friends of his. And And it was really intriguing because, most of this went down when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, but Ronald Reagan had since gone on to become president because it was 1983. And Ronald Reagan had brought a lot of people who were with him when he was governor of California to Washington, D.C., and they all occupied really high positions out there. And so the question was like, well, geez, like, are some of like the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. involved in this whole sex ring? And then, it's like, and then the crazy thing was, and then Vicky Morgan said, and not only was this all going down, but Alfred Bloomingdale rigged his sex dungeon with hidden cameras, and he filmed everything that had gone on there. Everything's on video. He used it to blackmail people, but Vicky Morgan claimed that she had some of the tapes herself. She'd stolen some of the tapes herself, and she had tapes of some very powerful people doing some really bad stuff. And then right after she announced that, Vicky Morgan, she got her head bashed in with a baseball bat. She was killed one night, and it was claimed her roommate, his name was Marvin Pancoast, it was claimed that he, snapped because they had had an argument earlier, and because of that, he bashed her head in with a baseball bat. But there's most likely way, way, way more to the story because he later claims like he doesn't really remember anything. And then, I mean, there's just all these weird details about like the police. After this happened, he showed up to the police station and just walked. This is like 2 a.m. He just showed up to the police station, walked in the front door and said, "I just killed someone." And so that was kind of held up as like the evidence that, he'd done this. But he didn't have any blood on him when he showed up, which, if you bash someone with a baseball bat, you'd think blood spatters and everything. His fingerprints weren't on the baseball bat. It was just all these details that didn't really add up. And then, it kind of came out that like some people close to Vicky Morgan, they were involved in hypnotism. And so the question was like, well, was he hypnotized just to, go to the police station and say, "I just killed someone"? Yeah. And so that kind of comes into play. But the whole thing is really weird. It really gets to be crazy because after she died, her attorney claimed that he still had the tapes and he didn't really know what to do with them. He's like, "I have these explosive tapes that show really powerful, high people doing nasty stuff. I don't really want to get involved in this because, I value my life and everything." But he held a press conference talking about how he had these tapes. And then the very next day, he held another press conference saying that the tapes had been stolen during his press conference. And so now he didn't have the tapes anymore. He didn't know what happened to them. He didn't know who had taken them or anything. And so there was like this big, it was almost kind of like a running joke, like the Vicky Morgan tapes, like who had them. If you've ever seen the movie Fletch, he has a joke about the Vicky Morgan tapes in the movie.
I can see the Epstein files becoming like that in the future.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And then the real crazy thing was Larry Flynt got involved, and Larry Flynt ran Hustler magazine. Most people know him from that, but he was very like politically active. He like Hustler was known for their investigative articles. Like they really had some killer investigative articles over the years, even though they were known as a men's magazine. But then after these whole Vicky Morgan tapes went missing from the attorney's office, Larry Flynt then came forward and said, "I have the Vicky Morgan tapes now. I think he said he paid like a couple $1 million for them." And he's like, "I'm going to bust this whole thing wide open. I'm going to publish this in my magazine." And then didn't quite work out. It gets to be kind of complicated because the whole Larry Flynt thing is really, really wild. I mean, I've done a video just about Larry Flynt. And it's really interesting because just right around this time, Larry Flynt was starting another magazine. It was called The Rebel Magazine. And The Rebel Magazine was basically, because Larry Flynt had a magazine empire. He didn't just have Hustler magazine. He had over 100 magazines. And it was everything from like a motorcycle magazine to video game magazine. He had a whole bunch of magazines. And in 1983, he decided that he was going to start up a competitor to Time and Newsweek magazine. So he was going to start up a weekly news magazine that took those two on. And so he was going to publish these, Ronald Reagan, or not Ronald Reagan. Well, he did claim that Ronald Reagan was on the tapes. People didn't know whether to believe him or not, but he claimed he was going to publish, stills from these Vicky Morgan tapes in this magazine that he started. And then his life just kind of fell apart. He really believed that the government was trying to kill him, and he locked himself in his mansion, never left. Claimed he was being drugged and kind of driven out of his mind. He had a bunch of really nasty court cases right around this time. So his life was kind of like ruined right around the time that he claimed he was going to bust this Vicky Morgan story wide open. And so the whole thing is just really, really wild. But the tapes have never, surfaced or anything. So it's still kind of a mystery about, did they actually exist or not?
Yeah, that is pretty wild. Earlier you posed the question, are these politicians and very powerful people really involved with some of this sexual deviancy and blackmail and even pedophilia? I would suspect you can't get to those levels without being involved in some of that stuff, right?
Exactly. I think you can't get to certain levels unless they have blackmail material on you. Whether it's pedophilia or whether it's, something else in your background or something else that you've been caught doing on video. There has to be something that they can hold over you.
Yeah.
And be like, okay, you can do whatever do certain things or talk about certain issues, but don't step out of line. Don't try to go too far. Don't try to expose certain things, because if you do, we got this, nice little blackmail over you that we will release and just totally crush you, So I really think, like blackmail is the big thing. You just can't get to a certain level without there being some type of blackmail material on you.
Man, there's so many great topics we could get to. We have time for one more. Let's talk a little bit about the Tylenol murders video you did.
Yeah, that's a really great one. It's funny because I did the video, and then just a few months later, Netflix released a documentary about it, and it kind of re-entered the news. But the Tylenol murders is crazy. It happened. I think that one happened in 1983 too. 1983 was a pretty nuts year, but it happened in Chicago, and I think there were 7 or 8 people who died right after taking Tylenol for headaches. And so this whole story came out about, well, was somebody like secretly poisoning Tylenol and that's what was killing these people? Or was there something wrong with like the manufacturing of it? And it was just a massive story. People were super freaked out. The kind of somewhat interesting thing is Tylenol was still a really new product at the time. And I kind of talk about it in the video because kind of like the general, like the Netflix story takes this standpoint, and most other articles and things like that you read take this standpoint that there was just a lone crazed nut or a lone madman who was secretly poisoning these bottles. And this lone crazy guy, for whatever reason, just decided to do Tylenol, as even though he could have just gone to the supermarket and sprinkled poison or whatever onto fruit or done something very easy like that. For whatever reason, he targeted Tylenol specifically, and nearly bankrupted the company. The company was considered one of the great American success stories because they really, in a very short amount of time, just became massively, massively successful. But the thing that I talk about in the video is, could this have been a case of corporate sabotage, which is a really interesting topic that I think happens all the time. It's never really talked about much, but corporate sabotage is basically like these big corporations sabotaging their competitors and doing like really nasty stuff behind the scenes and having, kind of some pretty unsavory people who they use to sabotage their competitors. I think stuff like that really does go on way more frequently than people realize and way more frequently is talked about. It's something that I don't really see. One of those few topics that there's just not much out there about it. But anyway, what I talk about in the video was, it could have been a case of corporate sabotage where Bayer, who was Tylenol's biggest competitor, could they have been behind poisoning these Tylenol bottles because they were getting crushed by Tylenol? Bayer, for the longest time, they just dominated the painkiller industry. It was $1 billion industry. They had something like 80% of it, and they were just made money hand over fist. Then Tylenol came along just in the late 70s, so it was really hadn't been out for very long when these Tylenol murders happened, and Tylenol just started destroying Bayer and stealing literally billions away from them. And so what I wonder about, or what I kind of talk about in the video, is could Bayer have been behind these Tylenol murders? And Bayer has a really interesting history. They were a Nazi Germany company. They were an offshoot of IG Farben, which was kind of like the big Nazi, just this gigantic corporation that was involved in making like the Xylon B gas and used in World War II to gas people. They were just, IG Farben was just this massive company, and Bayer was one of the offshoots because after the war, IG Farben was forced to break up because they were just so big and so powerful. They broke up into a whole bunch of just different little, different other companies, and one of those companies that was formed was Bayer. And so anyway, Bayer was kind of facing a few issues at the time of these Tylenol murders that were kind of not really affecting them and kind of affecting their reputation. Bayer was being linked to this thing called Reye's syndrome, which was like an affliction, I guess, that was apparently being caused by like infants taking Bayer aspirin. And so there were some big articles right around this time about, well, is aspirin causing Reye's syndrome? And it just kind of seemed really coincidental how there was all this negative publicity surrounding Bayer at the time. They were getting crushed by Tylenol. And then these Tylenol murders happened where supposedly some random psychopathic guy just decided to poison bottles of Tylenol, of all things. And so I just kind of wondered, like kind of talking the video about, could there have been a connection between Bayer potentially being behind these poisonings?
Yeah.
So it's a real interesting.
It is, man. I love it. You do such great work. I am really hoping that we can get back and do this again. There's so much more that we can cover. Before I let you go, remind the audience how they can find more of you. And is there anything that you're working on upcoming that you'd like to share?
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, it's just Control-Alt-History, like Control-Alt-Delete, Control-Alt-History, YouTube. I primarily just do videos on YouTube, but I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. So you can find me there. I'm also on Patreon as well. And so that's where you can find me. And then as far as upcoming things, some of my recent things I've been working on is just kind of looking into the background of some celebrities and kind of talking a bit about their backstories and the families that they come from. Because some of the families that a lot of these celebrities come from are really interesting. I always talk about the book Weird Scenes in the Canyon by Dave McGowan, where he talks about how all these counterculture icons from the 1960s all had connections to the military. And so he kind of theorizes that the whole counterculture movement of the 60s was like a military operation. The military was using military-connected sons and daughters of military-connected families to kind of infiltrate this counterculture movement. Yeah. And there's just a whole bunch of celebrities who have just strange links to a lot of times like major events in history or like bloodline families,
military intelligence.
And so I've done a few videos. But yeah, absolutely. And so yeah, I just did a video about John Denver and his kind of weird background, and I've talked a bit about a few others, and then I have a few of those coming up as well. A few just celebrities I'll be looking into and talking a bit more about.
Right on, man. Awesome. Well, looking forward to those. And like I said, we'll definitely have to have you back on soon. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We will talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all then. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule. Check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order. Hello friends, I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order.